Absolutely. The short version for the backstory is that the Russians don't see Ukraine as the end of the war, but the beginning of the war, and they want to push past Ukraine further on until a geographic area that they feel they defend. So this isn't going to be a one-off. This is not about carving a small piece out of Ukraine. This is just the start of a much longer conflict. And in that sort of environment, you've got to take into account how oil moves. So the Druzhba pipeline that goes into East Germany, unless and until there is destruction of the pipeline, either because the Russians accidentally hit it with an artillery shell or Ukrainian partisans blow it up, it's fine for now. It's not going to be there in 3 months, but for now, that continues to flow because the German refineries don't have other options. They're not on ports. So they can't even truck in oil from elsewhere. It's the pipeline or nothing. So that's going to be probably the one that goes last. Novorossiysk on the Black Sea is in a war zone. So it's very difficult for ships to get insurance to even sail there at all. So they're operating at maybe 20% capacity on a good day. And that's not just Russian crude, that's also Kazakh crude. The CPC project out of Tengiz on the Caspian, that all goes to Novorossiysk, and the Tengiz project is about to shut down now because they can't get anything out. All of this is backing up pressure, and the facility on the Black Sea is now not the only one. There have been about 20 others that have either slowed or even stopped runs because they have nowhere to put their refining product. All that leaves is Primorsk on Baltic. Now that is a big discharge point. You're talking about 1.6 million barrels a day. That's not insignificant, but it's a shallow water port, so no super tankers.
Right.
So it's only shuttle tankers. Shuttle tankers have limited range that pretty much only goes to Northern Europe. And if you want to send it further, you have to get 6 or 7 of those things together and do a sea-to-sea transfer in the territorial waters of a NATO state in order to send it on. And that is not a viable long or even mid-term option. So we're seeing the pressure building up already, and probably within a month or two, they're going to be forced to shut in production for the long term. At a minimum, you're talking about needing to have a replacement government for the Putin regime. Well, the Russian government would need a completely new leadership cadre. It's not clear that one even exists. And then they would have to hold the line and generate stability lasting at least 10 years before you could even start the real work. So we're getting to a point where everyone but the Germans are cutting Russian energy out of their equation. And even the Germans are bending over backwards to try to build alternate infrastructure, but they're the ones that have the furthest to go, so it's just going to take a little bit longer. But at some point this summer, assuming that the oil is still flowing, the European demand for that stuff is going to drop, and there's no way that the Europeans are going to keep their waterways open in order to facilitate other people benefiting from what they're paying for. So one way or the other, we are looking at the end of open seas in many areas for oil transport.
What would Turkey say about this if there was to be if NATO were to suggest shutting that straight off?
We're not there yet. So I'm just spitballing here, but my best guess is that the Turks would manage to carve out an exemption for themselves so that they could still get crude access and food access on the Black Sea because they are a littoral state. But it's really difficult to see anything beyond that. No, the 2015 bill is what allowed the United States to export crude in the first place. Until then, we had not exported crude except for by executive exemption going back to 1973. So in 2015, we shifted the law so that crude could be directly exported without a presidential exemption any longer. That is the part that can be reconstituted by executive order from the president. But it does not include any other energy or energy products. So not LNG, not natural gas, not refined product, not electricity. So we would be entering in a world where the United States' supply of light sweet that until now has gone worldwide, that is removed. But American refiners could still export their surplus refined product, and American importers could still access international crude if they wanted to. But this is going to generate such a huge price disconnect in a post-Russian oil environment that we're talking about an environment with a functional ceiling in the United States, probably Canada, of about 70 to 80, and then a functional floor everywhere else that is at the absolute minimum like 170. And so in that environment, if you want to import crude in the United States, you have to really, really want it because you're going to pay a lot for it.
Give us your thoughts on North American energy strategy.
Well, if you go back to February 22nd, the day before the war started, I would say that the idea of getting more pipelines from Alberta to the United States was a dead letter, that we had multiple administrations that were for or against it, and nothing happened. And if it wasn't going to happen under Donald Trump, it wasn't going to happen, period. But now we're staring down a global energy shock, and that's going to change a lot of people's minds when it comes to energy security issues. But never forget that Biden, like Trump, like Obama, is a populist. And so he's not going to do things based on the economic numbers unless those economic numbers are something that directly impacts his political standing. So in the United States, gasoline prices are a hot button issue right now. And because of what's going on in Russia, they have gone up. And with what's about to happen in Russia, they're going to go up substantially. The oil export ban will help contain the damage. But in that environment, Albertan crude is being sold into a closed market, and it's not available for export. So you would be stuck getting the mid-continental price for oil within the United States, which will probably never go above 80 again because of changes that are coming. I don't think this can happen with crude. Now, that can change with an act of Congress. Congress is slow, and there are a number of factions involved, and most of them would probably be thrilled with having a cap on what oil prices in the United States can be. Now, you're right that there will be elasticity in other things, especially refined product, because if you can buy crude for $60 to $80 in North America as a refiner and then sell it into a global market where it's below or above 170, I mean, that's a slam dunk business decision. So we're going to see this explosion in refining capacity expansion in the United States, specifically along the Texas coast, to take advantage of that differential. The elasticity that we're likely to see is going to be in other things. For example, California didn't participate in the shale revolution. They're not linked into the American oil transport grid in any appreciable way, and they are the state that imports the most crude. So I can see California having a price differential that is much more similar to what we're going to have in East Asia than what it is in the rest of the United States. And so Americans will have the option of an arbitrage internally that could make them a lot of money. As for Canada, you guys are in a supersaturated market and you're selling into a supersaturated market. You're actually more insulated from the global price pressures than almost all Americans. Now, if you're an oil consumer in Canada, that's great. If you're an oil producer, it's the other thing. But one of the things that we're seeing with crude right now is we know we're going to lose 4 to 5 million barrels a day of Russian crude. That is going to force the Europeans to go re-interface with a lot of their former colonies in Africa to make sure that crude goes north instead of east, which means that you're going to have this massive shortage in the Chinese market. They're not going to be able to function if they lose half their energy. So in the time that it takes a new pipeline to get stuff off to the Pacific, there's probably not going to be a Chinese economy to sell to it.
How bad are things in China, in your opinion?
They're pretty horrific, and they're getting worse very quickly. And it's coming from a number of directions. So on the COVID front, they don't have a vaccine that works. Full lockdowns are the only tool that they have. So they've already locked down Shanghai and Ningbo. They're in the process of evaluating whether they need to shut down Guangzhou, but it looks like almost certainly at this point. So that takes the two largest industrial and manufacturing centers in China, responsible for roughly half of the total. It just takes them offline for an indeterminate period of time. The Shanghai lockdown has now been in place for 2 weeks already, and there are no signs from the government that there's going to be any meaningful loosening of that. So the ports are down, the manufacturing is down, the people are locked up. The only facilities that are still running are those who have decided to keep their workers captive. And since Omicron is more communicable than measles, this is the start of this, not the end of this. This is the new normal for Chinese manufacturing. This is as good as it's going to be. On the energy side, the great loser from the Ukraine war, after Ukraine obviously, is China, because the energy that goes direct from eastern Siberian fields to China can only be produced by foreign firms. The Russians can't operate those projects. They're all getting shut down. So that's going down. And then anything that might come the long way around has to go through that shuttle tanker repackaging,
right,
sailed by a bunch of NATO countries, and ultimately make it. And that's just not a very feasible plan, especially when people are talking about energy security. And that's before the Europeans start redirecting anything or the Indians start getting politically active in the Persian Gulf, all of which is going to happen this year. So we're looking at a sustained energy, not shock, shortage in the Chinese market that is going to last at least several years. And then at the top, Chairman Xi has intimidated or executed or exiled everyone who is capable of independent thought in the country into silence, destruction. And so China cannot adjust its policy because there's no longer a cadre of smart people to make the policy in the first place. People are carrying out what Xi says to the best of their ability because he's their emperor, and that's that. And so we're seeing these amazing policy disconnects in health, in agriculture, in electricity that shouldn't happen in a country that has a leader with an IQ of at least 95. And it's destroying the Chinese capacity to be the China that we know.
Could China become a failed state?
I think we're on our way to that. I don't think China's going to be a nation state by the end of the decade. I think we're looking at dissolution. If you look at the 5,000 years of Chinese history, this is the norm. Now, there's a lot of other things going on with the Chinese space regards to the Ukraine war, because at first, the Chinese saw the war starting like, excellent. We're going to get a litmus test for our strategy for Taiwan. It's going to be easy, and we're going to show the world that we can just go and grab it, and they just have to suck it up. It has not gone to plan. So number one, the Russians are having some severe problems in dealing with the Ukrainians, and the Russians know where all the infrastructure is in Ukraine. There is a huge population mismatch, there's a huge military mismatch, but most of all, there's no barrier between the Russians and the Ukrainians, and they're still having problems. Well, Taiwan has been preparing for the China war now for 70 years, and there's a body of water in between. So all of a sudden, these rosy military goals and estimations that the Chinese had have gone out the window. Second, the sanctions. Say what you will about the Russian economy. It's not great, but they are a massive exporter of food and energy. If the sanctions that were on Russia now were put against China, China would decivilize in less than a year because it's the world's largest importer of food inputs, and energy. There's no way you can maintain that system without full access to everything. And probably the one that even worries the Chinese more now are the boycotts. The idea that people, individuals, have any say in how an industrial process might happen or on like war policy, that's just antithetical. But it's happened, and it's been more effective against Russia than the sanctions have been. Well, that's the entire Chinese economic model. So the Chinese now know that what they've been preparing for 50 years, they've been preparing for the wrong thing. And since Xi has gutted the intelligentsia, they no longer have the personnel to come up with another plan. So they're just slamming their heads into the wall over and over and over until their skull cracks. And that's what we're seeing in places like Shanghai right now. So every single province in Canada is more economically integrated with the United States than it is with their fellow provinces in Canada. So there's always going to be this economic pull to do things a little bit differently in Canada versus any other country in the world. Canada really is unique in that way. For Alberta specifically, the energy exports and the export taxes and production taxes on those exports, that is the single most important factor in what allows Canada to function in its current environment. If something happened to the oil income, the Canadian state would have a hard time providing for its citizens with its current budgetary outlays. When I wrote the first book 8 years ago, I called it The Alberta Question, and that the Albertans were going to very seriously discuss secession because that was the cleanest way to fix it. I didn't mean to say that it was an easy decision, but when it comes to finance and tax and inflation and labor, it would have fixed all of the problems. What's happened in the last 8 years since is, to be perfectly blunt, the Albertans have been pretty Canadian about it, pretty polite about it. And so there have been discussions and there have been complaints and there have been arguments and charges, but it has never risen to the point that a full independence referendum was ever, in my opinion, seriously considered. And as Albertan energy as a component of North American energy has relatively shrunk as shale has become more and more important in the United States, the interest on the American side for even paying attention to that discussion has dropped off. We may be entering a new period, though. With the loss of Russian crude and the upending of global energy, the crude blend mismatch between Canada, or between Alberta and the United States is so different, and it would be so beneficial for American refineries that all of a sudden it's coming back on the agenda really quick. So we're going to find out in the next 3 or 4 years just how much Alberta really is upset with its situation. Because in the next 3 to 4 years, the vast majority of the Canadian baby boomer cadre will have moved into mass retirement, and the state outlays that Ottawa has to do are going to be huge compared to what they have been, but the income hasn't changed. And so the income has to come from somewhere, and that somewhere is Alberta.
Yeah,
so the tax pressure you guys are used to is nothing compared to what's coming.